All right.
Okay, go right ahead.
All right. So as landscape photographers, one of the biggest challenges we face is how to adequately capture and render these three-dimensional scenes we see before us and translate them into a captivating two-dimensional representation. And there are three main scenarios where the camera can actually do a better job seeing the world than our eyes do. And this is what really got me super interested in photography, is when I started doing things like macro photography, because my eyes couldn't see what that camera lens is able to pick up. Another one is where we do long exposures. You know, when we were hiking in the Narrows today, that was one thing that really made it come alive, was doing those long exposures, getting that ethereal water flow coming right through the canyon. And it transforms the scene literally right in front of your eyes. But the third one is night photography. And indeed, the camera sensor, especially these great full frame sensors that we have on these modern cameras, they can see so many stars. They can see detail in the Milky Way and in the galaxies that there's no way our own eyes can do that. And going out and shooting at night will challenge you technically, creatively, and physically. But you'll be hooked once you see the capability of what the camera can capture that your eyes simply cannot. And shooting familiar scenes at night is a great way to create an eye-catching and intriguing photo. Not to mention, it's very peaceful because there's not nearly as many people out at night. And that's one of my favorite things to do, is just, while the camera's processing and I'm waiting for things, I just love just staring up into the skies and contemplating the cosmos. And night photography is so much more than just capturing a Milky Way. That's what everybody immediately thinks of. Now there's things like star trails where we can do really long exposures and show the long movements. Or there's things like Aurora Borealis, where we have cityscapes and blue hour. The list goes on and on and on. The where. Dark skies are becoming increasingly rare. As you can see here, in the late 50s, we had a large chunk of the western half of the country that was all dark skies. But you can see the increase in light pollution from these NASA photographs as we get into 1997. And then they're predicting by 2025 that this is what it's going to look like. It's going to be very hard to find areas where we have a truly dark sky. And so from 1947 to 2000, we've seen an approximate 6% increase in light transmission each year. And even wilderness areas now are being affected by the light pollution. And streetlights produce the majority of light pollution, and the glare is scattered by atmospheric particles, and it creates that glow that we see up in the sky. And so the Bortle scale was developed by an astronomer in 2001 to measure the brightness of night skies. And it goes from the scale of 1 to 9, where 9 is like an inner city sky, which is like New York City. And then 1 is like a truly dark sky location. And then you have all the shades of gray in between. And using light pollution measurements from ground and in space, these guys were able to create a virtual map of light pollution levels across the United States. And their website, the Dark Site Finder, shows these light pollution levels. So you can kind of go in and check, like where you're thinking of shooting. Is this really a dark sky location? And most importantly, is the direction you're going to be shooting looking into a dark sky area? Or is it looking into an area with a lot of light pollution? And as they say in real estate, I will also say in photography, it's location, location, location. And you have to choose your location carefully, because too much light pollution can make it almost impossible to see the Milky Way. And you want to shoot in a direction that points away from artificial light sources. And you want to aim for areas with that Bortle rating anywhere from about 1 to 3. It's kind of a funny story, but like back in the 90s, there was a power outage that affected Los Angeles. And during that power outage, the 911 call centers got all these concerned calls from people saying, hey, we see this weird cloud up in the sky. We don't know what it is. Is there something happening? And the attendant on the 911 call just had to explain to him that they were just seeing the Milky Way for the first time. And indeed, so many people that come on tours with us here in southern Utah, this is the first time, like when I was a kid at 10 years old, the first time they've been able to see skies that dark and to see the Milky Way so vividly. And a few light clouds can add a colorful accent, if there is nearby light pollution. And then the other thing is you have to pay attention to the moon phase. Too much moon will completely wash out the sky. And for the darkest skies, you want to shoot when there is no moon present. And you can find those moonrise and moonset times online or via apps. My favorite apps to use are TPE, the photographer's ephemeris, and PhotoPills. And you can still shoot the Milky Way as long as the moon is less than 25% illuminated. Once you get past like 20%, 25% moon, then it just gets way too washed out. And with more than 50% moon, the sky will really be washed out and shots will start looking like they were just taken during the day. And even very bright aurora borealis or northern lights can be difficult to see if there is too much moon. But light pollution can still be beautiful. Here's a shot I took in northern Arizona, and there was a nearby town that was putting out some light pollution. But there was just a few clouds up here. It caught that nice red glow from the distant light pollution. And I was able to kind of use that to frame the Milky Way. A lot of people in this shot ask me, is this the sun that's rising? Well, it can't be the sun that's rising, because if it was rising, you wouldn't see all these stars. This is actually some distant light pollution from a town way off in the distance. So when it's used properly, light pollution can be very beautiful. And another thing I will mention is that if you are in an area with a lot more light pollution, there are companies like Breakthrough Photography that make a light pollution filter. And what they've determined is that the wavelengths of light that are emitted by the street lights and everything else is all encompassed within a very narrow band. And so this filter will actually eliminate that particular band of wavelengths from your photo. And it can give you much higher contrast in your night skies. So it's not something I have to use where I live, but if I was shooting like night skies over in California, yeah, I would definitely be using one of their night sky filters. All right, let's jump in and talk about the when. So night photography requires careful date selection for the best results. Generally speaking, the 2-week window around the new moon period will give you those best results. And you just want to ensure the moon is less than 25% illuminated during the times you want to shoot. The galactic core of the Milky Way, which everyone loves to photograph, that's visible from early March, sometimes even the last week of February, if you have kind of a lower horizon. And it's visible all the way into early to mid-October. In apps like PhotoPills, TPE, Planet, and Stellarium, Stellarium is my favorite app to use when I'm planning things on a desktop computer. That's going to really help you plan your night photography outings. And the northern lights, if you're into shooting those typically peak around the fall and the spring equinoxes. And most people think it's got to be during winter time, but midwinter is usually not the best time. It's usually better in the spring and the fall periods. So the Milky Way is oriented southeast in the early spring, and it moves to the southwest by autumn. And so finding these south-facing compositions is going to be key. And in early spring, the Milky Way is low and horizontal to the horizon, and it's ideal for landscape orientations. It's also best in the early morning hours. So if you love waking up early, you're going to be out there photographing it at like 3, 4, or 5 o'clock in the morning. And so here's an example. This is what the Milky Way looks like in March. It's very horizontal, low to the horizon, great for landscape photos and for panoramic photos. And late in June to July, the Milky Way is visible all night long. So if you don't have any moon interference during the night, you can just keep shooting and shooting and shooting. And then by August through September, it becomes more vertical, and it's best for portrait orientations. And it's best photographed around like 10 p.m. to midnight at the mid-latitudes at which we live. And so here's an example from October. This is when I was over in Mongolia, which is almost about the same latitude as we are here. And you can see the Milky Way is very vertical at that point, but now the core is getting quite low to that horizon, and it's not long before it's going to drop completely below the horizon and won't become visible again until the very tail end of February. The blue hour is another one of my favorite times to shoot. And this is, I was over at this waterfall here in eastern Washington, and we were hoping to get some Milky Way when it was a little darker, but there was just too many clouds. But then as blue hour started to come along, then all this light pollution started to light up these low clouds, got this nice blue color up in the sky. You can see a little bit of the Milky Way up here. And of course, Jupiter is super bright. But I really like this effect. I like this almost more than having that crystal clear Milky Way up in the sky. So don't be afraid to shoot when there are clouds. It can be really beautiful. And, shooting in blue hour can really bring out some nice colors. And sometimes like shooting that Milky Way like 15 minutes before the end of astronomical twilight can give you the best color. So you can still see that Milky Way, you can still see the stars, but then you have that dramatic blue color. And it's also my favorite time if I'm going to go out and shoot cityscapes. So let's jump into the 4 fundamentals of night photography. Number 1, you have to have the right gear. There is no other photography discipline that requires more careful selection of gear than does night photography. Everyone will tell you, gear does not make the photographer. I agree with that 100%. But in order to get a high quality night photograph, especially when you're shooting at these very high ISOs, you have to have a really good camera. You have to have a really good lens. If you don't have that, then you're going to struggle to create those types of images. Second, you have to have solid infield technique. And I'll talk about what some of those techniques are. And then you have to have knowledge of lighting, whether you're using your own lighting to light up a landscape or you're using natural lighting. You have to be able to know how to harness that lighting and use it effectively. And then fourth, this one's super important. You've got to know how to do the post-processing. And there's so much that goes into post-processing. I'd say it's at least half the battle, if not sometimes more, than taking the photo out in the field. So let's talk about gear. And lenses matter much more than the camera body. So back when the Nikon D800 came out, I was shooting Canon at the time. And I had a Canon 5D Mark III. And I went and bought that Nikon D800 because everyone was just raving about it. And I got a Nikon 14 to 24 millimeter lens to go along with it. And I went out for a weekend and I did a head-to-head comparison between these two cameras. And I did some Milky Way shooting, did some other daytime shooting, and I came back and I compared my images. And it was a literal night and day difference between the quality I got out of that Nikon versus what I got out of the Canon. And indeed, the Milky Way shots on that Nikon just looked amazing. But on the Canon, they were soft, and they had all kinds of problems. And they just didn't work for me. So I thought, you know what, maybe I'm going to have to switch to Nikon. But then the thought occurred to me, what if it's that lens that's making all the difference and not just the camera body? And so I bought a little adapter. I put that Nikon 14 to 24 millimeter lens on the Canon, and I went out and repeated the test. And guess what? It was all the lens. Those Milky Way shots I was getting off the Canon now looked amazing. But that Canon 16 to 35 millimeter version 2 f2.8 lens I was using, that looked horrible. So choosing your lens carefully will pay huge dividends. And then the third point I want to bring up is a full frame camera will generally produce much higher quality images than a crop sensor. That's because the photo sites on these full frame cameras are generally much larger. They can capture stronger signals of light and produce lower amounts of signal to noise interference. And the other thing about full frame cameras is that they have far better lenses available for low light photography. Now, most night photography is done with the wider angle lenses, and you're going to want a lens that is f2.8 or faster whenever possible. And you can use an f4 lens on a camera body that allows you to really push the ISO, but I've always found I get the best results when I use lenses that are at least f2.8 or faster. So when shooting at night, the camera needs to capture as much light as possible. And that's why large apertures are needed. In other words, small f-stops. Now there are three main downsides to large aperture. The first one is you have reduced depth of field. Now it's very shallow. You have much softer images because the wider open you shoot that lens, the softer it's going to be. And then you have all kinds of optical aberrations that come along for the ride. Things like coma, vignetting, spherical aberration, so on and so forth. So with your lens that you're going to use for night photography, I recommend starting at f2.8. If you have a prime lens that goes below that, you want to test it first to make sure it performs well at wide open apertures. And a lot of times I see people that bring these super fast primes in, like one that goes to like f1.8 or f2.0 or something like that. The problem is those prime lenses that are that fast or often have so much coma or spherical aberration at those wide open apertures that it's almost unusable. And they often end up having to just stop their lens down to f2.8 to get rid of those optical aberrations. Now, since your depth of field is limited at wide apertures, I recommend shooting at standing height when you're shooting at night to avoid having a soft foreground. Now, if you decide you do need to shoot closer to the ground, the only way you can get that sharp is you're going to have to focus stack. And focus stacking at night can take a lot of time because we're talking long exposures now. And so it's something that you have to really want to do. And so if I can avoid it, oftentimes I will. Now let's talk about coma. Many people don't know what coma is. And a lot of these lenses are subject to coma aberrations, especially towards the corners. And this leads to triangle-shaped stars. And if you zoom in on your image and see these triangle-shaped stars towards the edges, then you're going to have to stop your lens down to get rid of it. And this is an example from my buddy Royce Bear up in Salt Lake City. And he took the Canon 24mm f1.4 lens. And at f1.4, the stars in the center, they looked reasonable. Midway, they're starting to see some triangles, and by the edge, they look like these little birds that are flying around. When you stop it down to f2, you still see these little birds, but they're not quite as large. And by f2.8, now it's starting to look like it should. And so you want to, if you're going to be using these fast primes, you definitely need to test them out for coma before you decide on the aperture you're going to be using for your night photography. So as far as some lens recommendations, I recommend zoom lenses because they are more versatile and they exhibit a lot less coma. And the prime lenses, they tend to have a lot more of the optical aberrations. And so with these fast primes, you may have to stop down to avoid the coma and the spherical aberration. So as far as the Canon camp goes, fortunately, since that time I did that test against the Nikon, they have now come out with the 16 to 35mm version 3. So if you're going to do night photography, make sure you get version 3. The version 2 is pretty much junk for night photography. The Nikon, they still have their wonderful 14 to 24mm lens, and they have one that's for the Z mount, the mirrorless versions, and also for the DSLRs. With the Sony, which is what I'm shooting currently, they have a 16 to 35mm f2.8 GM, and they recently came out with this 12 to 24mm f2.8 GM. And I recently picked that one up, and I am just amazed by the quality on that. The fact that they're able to make something so wide and still have it be f2.8 and have such great control of optical aberrations was just really groundbreaking. Now there's a lot of third-party lenses too. We have Rokinon 14mm, Rokinon or Samyang. They make a bunch of different prime manual lenses. They're fully manual in most cases. And it's a great budget choice if you're just getting into it and you just kind of want to get things figured out. Tamron makes an excellent 15 to 30mm f2.8. Sigma makes a 14mm f1.8. It's a big dog, but it's awesome being able to shoot 14mm at such a fast aperture. Sigma also has a 14 to 24mm f2.8. IRIX has a 15mm f2.4. Laowa has a 12mm f2.8 and also a 15mm f2. One thing that I will note, though, I do not recommend Zeiss lenses because they use very high contrast glass. And by using such high contrast glass, it really punches out the blacks when you shoot at night. And it's just doesn't produce a very pleasing result. So as far as camera recommendations, of course, full frame cameras are the tool of choice for night photography. Now, some of the newer crop sensors, like the Fuji X-T3, are very good when you pair them with quality lenses. So, you have to read reviews. Best thing you can do is just rent a camera before you buy it and go test it out ahead of time. Make sure it's something that you're going to like before you end up spending a whole bunch of money on it. And the problem with crop sensor cameras is they just don't have a very good selection of fast wide-angle lenses. And as I said before, the lenses matter far more than the camera body does. And if you put a full-frame lens on a crop sensor body, then you're going to lose that nice wide-angle field of view that we're trying to capture. Now, modern image sensors, they have much better low-light performance than older models. And, I see this day in, day out. Someone shows up with a camera that's 5 or 6 years old versus someone who has a camera that they bought in the last 2 years. And those newer cameras, they are so much easier to focus at night. The live views are just much brighter. They are able to show much better detail. And so, yeah, you might be happy with like your older camera, but the thing is these newer cameras, they make it so much easier. As far as camera recommendations, on the Canon side, we have the 5D Mark IV, the 6D, and the 6D Mark II is actually not as good as the original 6D for night photography. And then this new R5 mirrorless camera that they came out with, that thing is incredible. So everyone is just really happy with the latest and greatest camera body there from Canon. As far as Nikon goes, the D850, the D810, the D750, they'll all get you very good results. And then the new mirrorless ones too, the Z6, the Z7, or if you're one of those people that have like the D5, it's also a great camera. As far as Sony goes, they have the A7 II, the 3, and then they have an A7R4, which is like a 61 megapixel. Now I have the A7R4, and I would tell you, I don't like using it for night photography. It's just too high a resolution. And in order to get my stars really sharp, I have to expose for such short amounts of time that I'm just not getting as much light in as I would like. And so it's actually better to shoot cameras that are lower resolution when you're shooting at night because it'll allow you to expose for longer time and be able to get more light in. And then, that's kind of the reason why behind the Sony A7S series. Those are like low resolution cameras, but you can crank that ISO so high because they have extremely large photo sites. Then the Fuji, they make an excellent X-T3. Another thing to consider too is battery life. Make sure you read up on the battery life of that camera, especially if you want to do things like shooting 1 or 2 hour star trails. So behind the scenes equipment is the first thing, a very sturdy tripod and a bomber ball head. And it's very important when you're doing these long exposures, especially if there is any wind. And my pro tip here, don't extend your center column if your tripod has one, because that's the thing that's going to shake around and give the most, or induce the most amount of blur into your camera. Next thing you're going to want is an intervalometer or a remote cord. And these are essential to shoot exposures longer than 30 seconds or to take complex series of exposures like stacked star trails or time lapse. Now these newer cameras, they can be controlled via apps, but you want to make sure that you test that first before you go into the field. And a lot of these cameras too now have built-in intervalometers. So just you just kind of have to know your camera and make sure that you have the right equipment to do these longer exposures with. Make sure you have extra batteries, make sure you have some warm clothes, and then you want a headlight for navigation. A couple tips here, don't use a headlight to light paint. Never, ever, ever use a headlight for that. The harsh white light, that horrible blue color cast that comes from your headlight, it's rarely pleasing on landscape features. Next thing is don't use red light mode. Anytime someone turns on a red light while you're shooting, that shot is doomed. Red light is impossible to remove from a shot. It's far better just to use your white light and just always stay in white light mode. And the best thing you can do is just take your cell phone when you need to see stuff on your camera, just turn on that backlight on your screen, and then use that to illuminate your buttons to see where things are. Because that little backlight from your phone, that's not going to interrupt anyone else's shot. And so here's an example of a little workshop group that we had, out doing some night photography. And you can see even that little red light that goes off in the back of the camera, that's enough to put out quite a bit of light here at night, as you can see on the rock back behind these participants. So as far as infield technique, oh, sorry, I guess I'm hearing my own echo. I thought someone was asking a question. Never mind. Okay, so practice using your camera in the dark before you go out. This is really important. You want to know where all these controls are without having to turn your lights on. The more familiar you are with that back of the camera, the better, easier it's going to be for you. Then know how to switch your camera to manual focus. Any lens vibration reduction or image stabilization or in-body stabilization should be turned off. And be comfortable using your manual focus techniques. I'll give a little bit more on that later. Then you want to find the long exposure noise reduction setting in your menu. Know how to turn this on and off. To save time, you can turn off LENR on test shots. Just don't forget to turn it back on. Now, LENR, what it does is, let's say you're taking a 30-second exposure. Well, at the end of that 30-second exposure, it is now going to close the shutter, and it's going to take a dark frame exposure for the same length of time. And then the camera is going to determine from that dark frame where all the hot pixel noise is. And this is the noise that accumulates on your sensor because the sensor is heating up. And then it subtracts that noise from your raw image. So this is very different from high ISO noise reduction. The high ISO noise reduction that you see in your camera menu, that is only for JPEG images. But the LENR function, that is an essential thing you need to know how to turn on and off and use because it will actually impact your raw file. And then you want to experiment with high ISOs on your camera to find out where noise becomes unacceptably high. Most full-frame cameras can handle ISO 6400, with some of the better sensors being able to go to ISO 10,000 or 12,800. Like on my Sony sensors, I'm routinely shooting Milky Ways, at ISO 10,000 or ISO 12,800. A lot of times when I tell clients that they can shoot that high, they're like, whoa, we can't do that. I've only gone up to 3,200. The thing is, you'd be surprised at how well these camera sensors can handle these high ISOs. And now, just as a general rule of thumb, crop sensors, though, they shouldn't go above ISO 3200 unless you have one of the really good ones. And then you want to find any lights on your camera and cover those with gaffer's tape, especially if you're going to be using like a 2-second timer. That's a big one that really can be annoying to people. This is whenever you activate like a 2-second timer, you'll have this like little pulsating light on the front of your camera that can totally illuminate parts of a scene or throw some light where you don't want it. So just find those lights, put some gaffer's tape over them, and it'll make your life easier. So what is this hot pixel noise? Well, it's when the digital sensor heats up during these long exposures. And it can look like colored streaks and specks in the image. The amount of noise you get depends on 3 factors. The length of the exposure. Longer exposures, of course, create more noise. Second is ambient temperature. At very cold temperatures, you'll notice very little hot pixel noise, but at high temperatures, it becomes pretty much unacceptable. And then whether or not you use the long exposure noise reduction feature in your camera. So hot pixel noise can be very destructive to image detail if you try to remove it via post-processing methods. And most night shooters will use the LENR in their camera, or they'll take their own manual dark frames and subtract out the hot pixel noise themselves in post. For me, I prefer just to use it in the camera because it's just a lot simpler. So here's an example. Both of these shots were taken at ISO 800 for 5 minutes on a 60-degree night on a Sony a7R III. Now without LENR, look at what we get. We get colored specks all over the place. Now, can you imagine trying to clean all that up in post? Well, even if you did, and there are ways to do it, you're going to sacrifice about half your detail. Okay. Now, if I use the LENR in the camera, great, I'm still left with great detail. Now, there is some random characteristics to some of this hot pixel noise. You can still see a speck here, a speck here, a speck here. So, these are really easy to clean up. I can just go in with my spot healing brush in Photoshop and just zap them away. And it's not very destructive. But if I tried to clean all this up, it's not going to work well. So there are myriad opinions out there on whether to do LENR in camera or by manually combining dark frames and post-processing. And even though it doubles the exposure time, I prefer in-camera LENR for the following reasons. One, you capture the sensor noise signature close to the actual shot, so it is most representative of the current ambient conditions. Second, it's simple, it's just time consuming. The camera does all the hard work for you. And then you don't have to try to remember which dark frames go with each exposure. Many of the people who go the manual route end up having to take multiple dark frames just to average them together. And by the time you do all that, well, your total in-field exposure time is pretty much equivalent to just doing the in-camera LENR. So remember that ambient temperature has a huge effect on noise. If you're shooting in cold temperatures like 20 degrees Fahrenheit, well, you may not need much LENR. But, if it's like 80 degrees out, well, you're going to have tons of hot pixel noise. And in addition, if it's like 80 degrees out, your luminance noise also gets noticeably worse. So I almost say, if I'm shooting in higher temperatures at night, I see almost a stop or two of degradation in my noise performance on my camera. So my favorite time to shoot at night is when I have to really bundle up and it's cold out, because I get much better quality images. Okay, so autofocus lenses, they are designed to focus beyond infinity. And true infinity focus is rarely where that little scale on the lens shows you where it should be. And fully manual lenses, they are not designed to focus past infinity. They are the easiest to use at night because generally speaking, you just have to turn it over all the way to the infinity side and you're pretty much going to be in focus for your stars. If you have an autofocus lens, it's good practice to put your camera on a tripod and determine where the infinity focus is. So to do that, you want to set your aperture to wide open, like f2.8. For zoom lenses, you're going to use the widest focal length, and then you can repeat the procedure for more telephoto focal lengths to see if the infinity point changes. Many of these zoom lenses, they have focus creep, which means that if I zoom to a different spot on the lens, now the optimal place for infinity focus has also changed. And then using your live view on your camera, you're going to zoom in digitally on a distant landscape feature. And then you're going to turn your focus ring until it becomes tack sharp. Make sure you don't touch the zoom ring. You're only turning the focus ring. And then you're going to look at the focus scale on the lens and remember where that point is. If you're using a lens that doesn't have a focus scale, check where the focus is on the digital scale shown in the camera, and then use that as your starting reference point. And so when you're focusing at night, you have to then set your lens to the infinity point that we previously determined. If you're so far out of focus and you're trying to look around and find a star, well, guess what? You're not going to find it. They're going to be so blurred out and so out of focus, you'll say, well, there's nothing up there. I can't find anything. So make sure you set your lens close to the infinity focus point that you have determined. Next, make sure you have your camera set to high ISO, like your ISO 6400 and f2.8. Then you're going to point to an area of the sky where you have a bright star or a bright planet in the center of the frame. This isn't necessarily where you're going to have your composition. Most often, I have to point my camera in a different direction to acquire the focus, and then I have to move it back to what I intend to shoot compositionally. And you can even use distant lights like a street light way off in the distance, Or if you have nothing else around, you can even have your buddy run out with a headlight and stand like 60 feet away or so, and you can focus on that. There's a lot of ways to do it. And then using live view, you're going to zoom in digitally, not with the lens. You're zooming in digitally on the back of your camera. And you're going to zoom in until that star is well magnified in your live view. And then you're going to slowly rock the focus ring back and forth. And your goal here is to make that star as small as possible. We're not going after perceived sharpness on the back of that screen. We're going after size of the star. And if you have poor eyesight, I would recommend investing in a Hoodman loop or something that will help you magnify the back of your camera screen. Or get a mirrorless camera, and then you can just look right through the viewfinder and it's all magnified for you right there. Now, I like to go back and forth, kind of make the star larger, smaller, larger, smaller, until I find that minimum point. That's when I know I'm going to be in focus. And so then, being very careful not to bump the focus of the zoom rings, I move my camera back to the intended composition. Now, important, I drill this into my clients all the time. If you zoom or change your focal length, you will absolutely have to focus again. And if the camera has been moved or jostled much, it's always a good idea to recheck your focus. That's one thing that you need to be so anal about when you shoot at night. All it takes is a millimeter change on that focus ring, and that can go from a tack sharp shot to a completely soft shot, and you have to just throw all those files away when you get them on the computer. So always, always, always check your focus. Zoom in on the shot that you take, go to 100% pixel view, look around, make sure everything looks nice and sharp. All right, so let's talk about exposure time. Since the Earth is always moving, we are limited in how long we can expose for before the stars begin to streak. Now, I still hear people talk about this rule of 500. Some people call it a rule of 400 or a rule of 600. Those rules are obsolete because they do not take into account the pixel pitch of your sensor, in other words, your resolution. They don't take into account the aperture, and they grossly overrepresent the exposure time you can actually shoot. And so there's this new rule called the NPF rule. And the NPF rule, basically, it stands, N is the mathematical symbol for aperture, and then P is for pixel pitch, and then F here takes into account your focal length. And there's a lot of apps out there that can calculate this for you, and I recommend using PhotoPills for this, and they have a feature in there called spot stars. And so if you look at let's go to a 24 millimeter here. The rule of 500 says you could expose for 21 seconds. Well, not really. If you expose for 21 seconds at 24 millimeter, I can guarantee pretty much all of you are going to have streaky stars. So if we look at the NPF rule at f2.8 for a 22 megapixel camera, that says we can expose for 11 seconds. But if we have a higher resolution camera, like a 46 megapixel, now I can only expose for 8 seconds. That's quite a big difference, 8 seconds versus 21 seconds. And this is using what they call the default mode for the NPF rule. They even have another mode that's called accurate, which is if you're going to be making really large prints. And that would be even lower time than what this is showing you here. And then if you're interested, this is the formula for the NPF rule. I recommend just using an app and saving yourself the brain power of calculating that. White balance. Most people who shoot RAW tend to just leave their camera set on auto white balance or their favorite white balance selectors. And at night, I think you should go through the rigor of setting a more appropriate white balance, because the camera is just not going to be able to know how to do the white balancing when all it sees is pure blackness. And it will almost always meter the sky way too red. So it's going to be worth your while to set it appropriately. And I recommend a Kelvin temperature anywhere from about 3,400 to 3,500. And the other nice thing about this is it will help you get the color temperature correct if you're doing any of your own artificial lighting on a landscape. So here's an example. This is auto white balance. Everything looks very red. And then if I go to 3400 Kelvin, now the sky starts to look more natural. Then if I was going to do some light, my own lights on this landscape, I'd be able to get the light temperature correct for those lights and still get the correct temperature for my sky. Now during blue hour, you can use auto white balance, or you can like set a Kelvin temperature in the range of 4100 to 4500, depending on how much blue you want. So once you're on location, you're going to go find your composition and select your focal length. And if you let your eyes adjust to the darkness, in other words, don't keep turning on your headlight, you can see pretty well through the viewfinder at night. Now, since depth of field will be limited at these large apertures, don't get close to any foreground objects unless you are planning on focus stacking, which is a fairly advanced technique at night. And then you're going to level the camera, level that with the horizon. It's good to use that electronic leveler because at night you can be 10 or 20 degrees off and not even really realize it. And so it's good just to be in the habit of using that electronic leveler. You want to make sure any filters are removed unless you're using like a night sky filter, and that includes UV filters. UV filters can cause terrible reflection and flare and stuff when you're shooting at night. You just don't want to use them. And then you want to manually focus as we described earlier. You're going to set the camera to manual mode, and you're going to select your settings as we say here. You're going to set the shutter speed based on your focal length and your camera resolution. You're going to set the aperture to at least f2.8 unless your lens requires smaller aperture for coma. And you're going to set white balance in that 3400 to 3500 Kelvin range. You're going to set your ISO in the 6400 to 12800 range. And then you're going to turn on the long exposure noise reduction. Now, when you're just doing test shots, like if you're trying to figure out your composition, yeah, you can turn that off. You don't need to be waiting that extra time. But for any live shots, you definitely want to have that long exposure noise reduction turned on. And then don't use the 2-second timer at night if you can help it, because as I mentioned, it puts out those little pulses of light that can really screw up other people's images. And at night, the image on your LCD screen is going to look so much brighter than it really is, unless you dim the LCD brightness as low as it will go. Now, I don't recommend that anyone do that, because if you really dim your LCD brightness as low as it will go, then when you go to shoot the next morning, you're not going to hardly be able to see the back of your camera screen to be able to turn the brightness back up. So it's better just to leave it at normal brightness, but instead use your histogram to gauge your exposure. And it's funny how people take a shot at night and they'll have their night vision active and everything, and they're like, "Whoa, this shot is way too bright." And I tell them, "Hey, pull up your histogram," and they'll pull up their histogram, and almost all the pixels are in that lowest most quadrant. Generally speaking, if it's well exposed at night, you have to be pushing at least a few pixels up to about the midpoint of that histogram. So even though it may look amazing to you with your night vision, trust me, when you get it on the computer the next morning, it's going to be very, very dark. So make sure you're exposing it properly. Now, after you take your sky shot, that's when you're going to zoom in to 100% pixel view and ensure everything looks sharp. By 100%, I mean zoom all the way in as far as it will let you go. The caveat is with Nikon. Nikon cameras will zoom to 300%. And so you have to watch that little progress bar in the bottom. And when that turns green, that tells you when you're at 100%. If you zoom all the way in, you're going to have to back out a couple levels to see the appropriate pixel detail. Right. Okay, and then be very careful to recheck your focus. Always recheck your focus. Always check the sharpness of your images by zooming in digitally, especially if you're kind of moving around and trying different compositions and so forth. All right, so let's take a look at histogram here. As you know, this is just putting some light on a feature here. We got the Milky Way back here. Generally speaking, most of your pixels are going to be in this lowest most quadrant because the sky itself is quite dark. But you still need to have some of these pixels that push all the way up, at least to this midpoint of your histogram. Now let's jump into knowledge of lighting. So at night, your foreground or your landscape is going to be very dark or silhouetted unless you add some light. And there are 4 ways to accomplish this. One is to use the light from the stars. If you're going to do that, you're going to have to perform a very long exposure in the camera. And the light from the stars is very omnidirectional, meaning that it's just going in all directions at once. So foregrounds that are shot this way will often look very flat and dull and very 2-dimensional rather than 3-dimensional. Another way is to use low-level lighting. And that's where you set up 1 or more stationary light panels to help illuminate the foreground. A third way is to wait for the moon. And if you time your date right, you can shoot the stars and then wait for the moon to rise to illuminate the landscape. And then the 4th one is to shoot during blue hour. And during blue hour, there is still enough directional light to produce a very nice foreground, but it still has that very night look to it. And so I'll discuss these concepts in more detail when we get to the 3 levels of night photography. So as far as low-level lighting goes, we prefer stationary lighting over dynamic lighting. Dynamic lighting meaning that you're just taking a light and moving it around to try to light something up. The reason that stationary lighting works so much better is that you get repeatable results with every shot. And then it's easy to dial in the exact light levels that you need and to make small adjustments. Third, it enables you to focus stack. So if you are going to focus stack a foreground, that means every shot that you take with that focus stack is going to have the same exposure on it, the same amount of light. And then it enables you to take equivalent exposures at lower ISO and longer time. So always set up your light at oblique angles. Don't be setting up the light right behind you where you're shooting. You want to have it coming in more from the side or even from the back. And that's going to give you a much more dynamic looking type of light. And when possible, try to stay behind the plane of the camera just so you avoid creating flare with your lens. And if the shadows are too harsh, that's where you need to add a second fill light at reduced intensity. And then you can use things like diffusers, snoots, color temperature orange gels to help control the light and the color temperature. The Z96 light panel is my preferred light source for small to mid-range light painting. And they can be picked up for like 80 bucks. They run on AA batteries or also on a rechargeable battery. And they come with a little dimmer switch. They have an onboard diffuser and a CTO gel that goes right over the top. And basically, they just create great results right out of the box. And you can learn more about low-level lighting at this website that my friends Royce Bear and Wayne Pinkston set up. I encourage you to visit it, lowlevellighting.org. All right, so here is an example of low-level lighting. So I used a couple different lights that I set up off here in the distance. And I had to set up 2 different lights here because I had kind of a wide range of landscape features to light up. And so I shot this foreground at lower ISO. The reason I did that is so I could get better detail on my landscape. And I shot that for 180 seconds at ISO 800. And then I shot my sky up here at ISO 10,000 for 13 seconds. And I shot it 8 times in a row. And I stacked those shots for noise improvement. I'll talk about that in a little bit down the road. So should you use low-level lighting? Well, it's all a matter of personal preference. I recommend you take both natural and light painted shots so you can choose your favorite later on, or you may even choose to use a blend of the 2. And sometimes you can get the really neat effect by combining light painting with that natural light source. And if you're trying to get starlight reflections, make sure that you have none of this artificial light hitting the surface of the water. If you do that, then you're just going to eliminate your nice possibilities for reflections. And low level lighting can make your post-processing work much easier because you're not trying to merge shots with very different exposures. It can take quite a bit more skill though to blend natural light shots. One time I was shooting with a client at night, and I was trying to explain to him that he needed to use natural light and do a long exposure so he could get this nice reflection in the river below. Well, this other photographer came along, and this photographer said, "Hey, can I shine some lights for you?" And we're like, "Okay, you can do it a little bit." So he shines this light out there, and my client took a shot, and he's like, "I love it with the light." I'm like, "All right, well, if that's really what you like, then that's how we're going to shoot it." But, for me personally, I thought it looked terrible. So everybody has their own preferences. It's not that one way is right and one way is wrong. It's all based on what you like. And this is an example right here. This is when he came and shown that light, and my client's like, "I love this." But then, this is what I was trying to get him to shoot, where you can get more of this reflected starlight down in the river. So very different results, but use different techniques, to capture each photo. Here's an example of like blending stuff together. This is from Bryce Canyon. If I use low level lighting here, 90 seconds at ISO 1600, it's pretty harsh. We have a lot of shadows here that I can't really deal with too well, especially here in the nearest foreground. But then if I shoot with the natural light for like 180 seconds at ISO 1600, or even brighter here, 550 seconds at ISO 1600, you can see just how flat this landscape looks. If there wasn't any snow here, it'd look even flatter. And here we have a lot of three-dimensionality, but we have kind of those harsher shadows. Well, the thing is, I can blend this one with this one. Now I can get the best of both worlds. I can get three-dimensionality in the landscape, but I've also was able to eliminate some of these really harsh shadows. So now let's jumping into post-processing know-how. Post-processing skills are essential to success in night photography. And you always want to take your shots with post-processing needs in mind. And even if you don't have the post-processing skills now, they can always be learned down the road as long as you have the correct files to work with. Post-processing is often the most difficult part for people to learn, and it can take years to master. So don't think you're going to just watch one video on Photoshop and all of a sudden you're going to be really good at it. Practice is key. You're going to have to work at it again and again and again to improve your skills. And you want to start small and work your way up to more complicated edits. Now, the rapid advent of post-processing technology has both pros and cons. The pros is that it's much easier to put together complex series of night images with low noise and high quality. The cons is that it's easy for night images to be manipulated or entirely faked. And it can be difficult to know which images were captured in the field versus ones that were just digitally created. And everyone is free to create their own style. There is no right or wrong. You need to define what your art means to you and what you want it to represent. And you need to understand your own standards and ethics and establish how that will guide you in your post-processing. Now, as far as my mission, I got into photography because I wanted to share the inspiration of the natural world with others. And I strongly believe in portraying real places under actual conditions that can be seen and appreciated by anyone who goes there at the right times. And so I embrace techniques that compensate for the limitations of digital cameras. And that includes things like stacking sky shots for noise reduction, shooting foregrounds at lower ISOs, using low-level lighting to illuminate foregrounds, etc. So as far as my general post-processing guidelines, you're going to want to use a calibrated monitor to ensure you have color accuracy. You want to use the latest versions of the software. The post-processing technology has come such a long way, and the newest versions will make a very big difference. And then your eyes can easily get accustomed to an image when you're working on it. So you want to take a break once in a while and work on something else. And when you come back with a fresh set of eyes, it can look drastically different. And many photographers I know, they won't edit and publish a shot on the same day. You know, looking at it again at that shot like a few hours later or like the next day may reveal a lot of things that you didn't see during your previous edit session. And then to find the sweet spot, you often have to over tweak and then dial it back a few notches until it looks good. And so by over tweaking, you kind of know, okay, well, this is what I did. This is the result of going too far. Now I want to eliminate those artifacts. Now I have to dial that back to a certain amount. So how do I use post-processing? Well, I use it to restore sharpness, contrast, saturation, and dynamic range lost as a result of a digital raw capture. I use it to reduce noise that comes from shooting higher ISOs and long exposures. I use it to remove distortions and vignetting from the lens. And I use it to make selections and independently process the land and the sky to achieve specific creative objectives. And then I use it to blend different exposures or types of lighting to manage overall dynamic range and contrast. And I use it to focus stack in situations that are depth of field limited. And I also use it to combine panoramic shots to capture a wider view than is possible with a single shot. So that being said, let's go into the 3 levels of night photography. Level 1 is the easiest. It's a single shot, there is no Photoshop. The foreground will be dark or silhouetted if you are using entirely natural light. Now the foreground will be nicely illuminated if you are using the low-level lighting. You should expect a lot of noise and grain in both the sky and the landscape. The detail in the landscape will be lacking because of the high ISO. Right, level 2 is 2 shots. In this case, you do one for the sky at the high ISO, but now you're going to do a second shot for the landscape at lower ISO, but much longer exposure time. Photoshop is then required to select the sky from one shot and merge it with the landscape from another shot. If you do a level 2, the landscape will have much better detail retention due to the lower ISO. And then you will have to apply some luminance noise reduction for your sky using the post-processing methods of your choice. Now, people don't often believe me when I tell them this because they'll say, hey, the image looks just fine on my camera doing it as a level 1. But as soon as I have them reduce that ISO and shoot that longer time and have them zoom in, all of a sudden it's like a night and day difference between how good the detail looks. Now, level 3 is the most complicated. In that case, we are now going to shoot multiple exposures for the sky. We're going to shoot like 8 to 12 images back to back to back to back. And then, or you can use a tracker device just to do a longer exposure and have it move in accordance with the Earth's rotation. And then the foreground is done the same as you do for level 2. It's going to be shot at lower ISO for that detail retention. Now, a lot of people ask me, well, why wouldn't you just stack the foreground too? Well, the reason why is that garbage in equals garbage out. So if I take a high ISO shot for the landscape, I'm going to have mushy detail. Doesn't matter whether I take 8 or 12 of those shots, I'm still going to have, the end result is still going to be mushy detail. The only way to get sharper detail is to shoot lower ISO and longer time. And if you do a level 3, both the sky and the landscape will be very clean with very little noise, very little grain. So the pros of a level 1 is that it's very simple. You don't have to have any Photoshop skills. Now with low level lighting, a level 1 shot can look nice just right out of camera. It's also perfect if you're doing like a foreground silhouette. And then the image would be eligible for entry into photo contests that don't allow blending for more than 1 frame. The cons of a level 1 is that the foreground detail will be very poor due to high ISO. The color and the luminance noise will require detail-destructive noise reduction techniques. And the image may not print well at large sizes. And then the foreground will be very dark if you're not using low-level lighting. So when would I use level 1? Well, here's a couple examples. I set up a little light here and lit up the saguaro cactus. And I actually took the shots I could have used this as a level 2. But when I went into post-processing, I realized that the edge of the saguaro had all these little needles on it. And trying to make an accurate selection around all those needles was just way too complicated. I didn't want to deal with it. So I just left it as a level 1 shot. Here's one. This is a little self-portrait I did of myself. And I went and tried to stand really still here while I was on my bike. And I knew I couldn't hold still for much more than 10 seconds. And so there's no way for me to do a long exposure for me in this foreground. So often, if you have a person in your shot, you're pretty much going to have to do it as like a level 1, because they're not going to be able to hold still for much longer than the Milky Way exposure time. Here's another one I did as a level 1. This is a combination of 5 vertical images. And because I was just shooting silhouettes of these trees, I didn't need incredible foreground detail. I'm just fine with everything shot at ISO 10,000. So there are times where level 1 can make your life a lot easier. Level 2, the pros are foreground detail will be considerably better compared to level 1. The images can be printed larger with good quality. If you're using natural light, a long foreground exposure will bring out additional detail. The cons, the sky may require noise reduction in post-processing. The shots are going to be a lot more time consuming in the field due to the long exposures for foregrounds. And note that this technique does not work if your lighting is inconsistent or if the subject has movement. And level 2 requires much more post-processing time and Photoshop skills, because sometimes making a really good sky selection can be quite tedious. So here's an example of level 2. It's using that same one I was showing you from before. So this is a shot here, ISO 10,000 for 13 seconds. If we zoom in on this toadstool, you can see how we have all this grain here on the landscape. The rock isn't very sharp, nor are the edges very sharp if you look down here. Now compare that to an equivalent exposure, but longer time, because we went down to ISO 800. Now this is 180 seconds. Look how clean the edges of this are. Look how much more detail we see. We don't have all this grungy looking noise everywhere. It's a huge difference. Here's another example of a level 2. This is a 20-second sky exposure at ISO 6400. And I put a little light here in this tent. But look how you can't see anything here. You don't know what's back behind this tent. If I did this as just a level 1, this is all I would be able to get, okay? But instead, I did a second, much longer exposure at ISO 1250. And now once I did that, I can see that I have a huge canyon back behind this tent. Now all of a sudden the shot has context. And then I could blend the two together using level 2 techniques. And now I have a very compelling night image. Here's a final example here. This is an arch near my home here in Kanab. And I had to use 3 different lights. I had to put 2 lights underneath here for the underbelly illumination. I added an extra color temperature orange gel to those lights to get that nice warm glow. And then I put another light way back behind over here off to the side to kind of fill in the foreground shadows right here. And so I shot the sky at ISO 6400 for 20 seconds at f2.8. Then I reduced my ISO to 1600. I shot it at 110 seconds, also at f2.8. Then I had to go in when I did the post-processing and make a careful selection along the edge of this arch, inside these little holes as well. And then use the landscape from the ISO 1600 and the sky from the ISO 6400. Now, why wouldn't I have maybe used a level 3 here? Well, the problem with the level 3 shot is that we have these little holes here. If I try to stack that by doing multiple sky exposures, well, I'm just not going to have enough data within this small little opening to be able to average away that noise. It's not going to work. It's going to look bad. So whenever I have like small openings or very complicated sky land type interfaces, I find that a level 2 technique works much better than trying to do stacking and tracking and all that complicated stuff. Here's another level 2 edit. Sky is shot at 10 seconds, ISO 10,000. The landscape was shot at 4 minutes at ISO 800. Okay, let's jump into level 3. The pros, both the sky and the landscape will have great detail and very low noise. And the shots will be suitable for very large prints, provided they were shot with sufficiently high resolution. The cons is that this is the most time-consuming technique, both in the field and on the computer. It requires even more advanced Photoshop and software skills with third-party software. And then it's going to require additional software on your computer if you're stacking, or additional hardware if you're using a tracker device out in the field. And it's not suitable, as I mentioned, for images with a complicated sky and land interface. So let's talk a little bit about trackers and stacking. With advances in digital photo processing, trackers and stack shots are becoming popular to help reduce noise. You know, as I mentioned before, a tracker is going to move your camera in accordance with the Earth's rotation. And depending on the quality of the tracker, you can do night sky exposures in the range of 2 minutes up to several hours and get pretty sharp results. Stacking shots will also reduce noise in high ISO images. So that high ISO noise that you're getting in your image, it's very random. It moves around in every shot. And so if we were to take like 8 to 12 shots and we were to line them up, you know, kind of take out the rotation of the Earth and line them all up on top of each other, well, all of the stars are going to be right in the same spot. But that high ISO noise, since it moves all around, it's going to get averaged out when we take a median average. And so that's going to give us much cleaner sky images when we stack them and average out that noise. So for the type of night photography I enjoy doing, which is like expansive night skies with identifiable landscapes, stacking makes the most sense. And you know, for me, trackers, they add capital expense. They're more weight to carry into the field. They take time to get them aligned. You know, I recommend trackers more to those who really like to shoot details of the night sky and want to like zoom in more and get more like telephoto shots of night skies. You know, stacking, on the other hand, it doesn't add much more time when you're in the field. And even if you aren't going to stack in post-processing, it's still a good idea to take multiple sky shots when you're in the field. The reason why is that, you know, so often when I'm shooting like a series of shots to stack, I might get a shooting star in one of them. Then I can use that shooting star in my post-processing. Or if I had some airplanes flying through in one, well, now I can use other shots that don't have the airplanes in them. And you can also turn off the LENR, the line exposure noise reduction, when you're doing stack shots. Because if you are going to stack these together, the stacking is going to average out all that hot pixel noise. You won't even have to worry about it. And you also want the least amount of registration error from shot to shot because of the rotation of the Earth. And so Photoshop is required to blend both stacked and tracked images with the landscape. And stacking is going to take more time in post-processing, but stacked images are going to line up better with the horizon of your landscape shot. If you're using a tracker, then your horizon is always going to be flubbed up because now the tracker has moved the camera in accordance with the Earth's rotation. And so you're going to have to do a lot more work trying to composite those two images together. So for stacking, the software you're going to want to use on Windows is Sequitur, and on Mac it's called Starry Landscape Stacker. And so here's an example. This is just 8 images. I actually like to use 12 images now. I say anything 16 and beyond is kind of overkill. So this is a raw file, ISO 10,000, 13 seconds. And you can see up here in like these more flat tonal areas, we have a fair bit of noise going on. But if I stack 8 different TIFF files, look how clean that is. You know, I'm not seeing that noise up here in between all the stars. It's a definite noise reduction. Now here's an example from an upper right corner. And upper right corners tend to kind of look the worst. So here's a raw file. You can see we have a lot of noise in between the stars. We stack them. Now it's really cleaned up. Now here's an example of a level 3 shot scenario. So this middle shot here, now this was my sky shot that I took at ISO 10,000. And I took this shot just before astronomical twilight. It was probably like 4:45 in the morning kind of thing. And then the right, this is my foreground shot. And I took this after the sun had just barely started coming up. And so now this is blue hour. I've got some directional light coming in. And so I took that at ISO 800 in 30 seconds. And then I produced my final blend. My sky is 8 shots that I stacked together at ISO 10,000 for great noise reduction. My foreground was taken as 3 shots that I focus stacked 30 seconds each at ISO 800. So I focused once here, and then once here. Here's an example from Death Valley. We were out on the sand dunes, and I hiked clear over to this other dune way far off here to put another light to give more three-dimensionality to my landscape. Then I had another couple lights illuminating this nearer dune. And so for the sky, I did 8 shots stacked at ISO 10,000. And then for the foreground, because I was a little bit lower, because I really wanted to bring out these foreground ripples, I also had to focus stack this at ISO 800. Now, each of those shots at ISO 800, I think they were somewhere probably around 3 to 4 minutes in length, plus another 3 to 4 minutes of long exposure noise reduction. So if you figure that out, I'm going to be involved in just shooting the foreground for almost 40 minutes, which is why I said, if you're going to focus stack foregrounds, it's going to take some time. You really have to want to do it. But you can see, look at the results. If you zoom in out here, look how clean this landscape is. Look how clean my sky is.
Hey, David, can I ask a quick question on that?
Yeah.
So with the focus stacking, would you be able to get similar results if you cranked up the f-stop to like f8 or f10 or 14 or something like that to cut down on time, or would it just distort kind of what you're doing with the foregrounds?
You could do that. You'd really have to expose for a super long time.
Right.
Yeah, and the thing is, I usually don't do that because you are right. It changes the optical path when you change the aperture. And so it wouldn't quite line up the same way. Now, there's ways you can get around that in post. You can just kind of move your sky down a little bit to kind of take out the impact of the horizons not lining up perfectly. But yeah, that certainly could be an option. It would help reduce, probably give you a little sharper.
Yeah, I tried that out in Nevada over the summer and got okay results, but I wasn't sure if it was because of that or not. But anyway, I just figured it was an interesting question. So thank you.
Yeah, well, thanks for asking. All right, here's another one that I did out in Death Valley. So sky was 13 seconds, 10,000, 8 shots stacked. Foreground, I dropped to ISO 800, shot it for 240 seconds. This is a super easy selection to make with such a clean mountain line right out there, and great results. All right, so at this point, let's see what time it is. So we probably better be wrapping up here pretty soon, but does anyone have any questions for me?
We are fine on time. Does anyone have any questions?
Hey, David.
Sorry.
Yes.
Go ahead, Cindy.
When you were showing those blended shots at Bryce, you showed the one where you had the natural light along with the lighting that you used. Did you blend that when you shot it, or was that blended in post?
That's always in post.
Okay, that's what I thought.
It's all done through Photoshop layers.
Okay.
I have a question. Do you have any certain kinds of intervalometers that you recommend over others? have tried so many different kinds, and so I'm just curious if you've found ones that work better than others.
The ones I wouldn't recommend are the name brand ones, like the ones made by Canon or Nikon, because they charge way, way too much for those. I find that the cheap ones you buy in Amazon or eBay for like $7 tend to work better. But they all have their little quirks. Like some of them don't have an on-off switch, so you have to pop the battery out every time you want to turn them off. And a lot of them is just about getting used to where are the controls on that intervalometer and how do you set it when you're out at night. And so many people don't know how to do that. So play with it before you go out in the field.
Anyone else?
All right. Well, thank you so much, guys, for allowing me to present tonight. And Kathy, you did record this, correct? So,
Yes, I did.
awesome.
Yeah, I will put a front end on it and stick it up on our YouTube channel. I will say by Thursday or Friday, we'll try to get that done. So
right.
You can, and I'll let people know on our Facebook page that it's up there. So.
Okay, sounds great. Well,
Okay,
thank you,
well,
everyone.
thank you so much. That was really
Thank you,
great.
David.
Lots
Thanks
of
for
really
spending
good
time with us. That was
information.
great.
That was
All right.
outstanding. Thank you.
Well,
Yeah,
thank
thanks,
you.
Dave.
Thanks, David.
Have a good night.
Thank you,
Bye.
David.
Okay. Stop the recording.